So it is Monday, the 2nd of October, as I'm doing this recap for the week. I'm going to go back as far as Sunday, the 24th of September, and then we're going to look at the headlines or major headlines that stuck out to me as I was preparing my videos for kind of a comprehensive overview of what's happening in Ukraine. It was a much slower week last week, and that is important to understand. Ukraine can't really afford the slowness. They need a quicker tempo. They need things to happen because really slowing down for the winter is coming, and slowing down is actually working in Russia's favor, not in Ukraine's favor. Things happened last week, but not like the week before or the week before that. It was a pretty significant number of events in the 2 weeks before. Okay, Sunday, 24 September 2023. On RT, Tucker Carlson was saying that the U.S. government stopped me from interviewing Putin. And here's a quote from that article. Quote, "I tried to interview Vladimir Putin and the U.S. government stopped me," Carlson claimed in an interview with a Swiss publication. Well, I'm not exactly sure what happened there, but again, it was something that RT was highlighting because RT tends to love Tucker Carlson, which tells you about what you need to know about what Tucker Carlson is saying. Okay. War crimes dossier to accuse Russia of deliberate starvation in Ukraine. So this was in The Guardian. There are dozens of lawyers working on Ukrainian or Russian war crimes of Ukrainians, and that includes deliberate starvation as one of their tactics. Canadian House Speaker apologized after praising a veteran of a Nazi unit. So this was a really bad look, and you saw this all week in the Russian repeaters, the parrots that take Russian propaganda points and say it on their YouTube channels. Quote, "I particularly want to extend my deepest apologies to Jewish communities in Canada and around the world. I accept full responsibility for my action," Rhoda said. Hunka could not be immediately reached for comment, unquote. Hunka was the Nazi, the 90-plus-year-old former Nazi. He was Ukrainian who worked in a Nazi SS unit, and he is now living in Canada. And I can't understand who didn't do their homework in the Canadian Parliament, and then why Hunka would actually agree to this. Like, hey, we know that you're Ukrainian, we know you're here, you were in World War II, come and be our guest and be honored here. And like, you'd think he would say, this might not be the best idea. Maybe I'll sit this one out. But he didn't, and it was very strange. Okay, Monday, the 25th of September, the AFU, the Armed Forces of Ukraine, claimed commander of Russian Black Sea Fleet was killed in a missile strike on a headquarters just a few days previous. So they're making that claim. Now, when I saw that, I thought, wow, that's something significant. And then I double checked and I looked at I don't know if it was BBC or The Guardian or Radio Free Europe and a bunch of other, just to triangulate to make sure that they had their facts straight. Like, yes, he was killed. It wasn't just Ukraine claiming, but other major papers were saying what happened. And then I put out a little short video about that because I verified, and wow, that's a pretty significant thing. Turns out, well, you'll see how it turns out in just a little bit. Russia attacks Odessa with 19 Shaheeds, 2 Onyx, 12 calibers. 11 of those missiles are shot down. This was just an Interfax Ukraine message, a very short thing. Pravda said Viktor Medvedchuk proposed 3 conditions for peace in Ukraine. If you don't know who Medvedchuk is the guy that was an opposition leader in Ukraine before the war. He's cozy with Putin. Some people thought that if they had removed Zelensky, Putin would have installed Medvedchuk. So that gives you a sense of where he was going with that. And then Lavrov said, and this was in Pravda, Russia respects Ukrainian sovereignty, but will not, bend to Zelensky to talk or bow to Zelensky or whatever. I'm thinking, like, you respect Ukrainian sovereignty? Doesn't look like you do when you rolled over the borders. Okay, Tuesday, 26 September, Moscow and Kyiv trade drone attacks, and it wasn't very much, but they were both at each other. Not nearly as big as they were the week before, but still at each other. Occupied Donbass residents ask why Russia liberated them from food and water. Okay, this was in the Kharkiv human rights news. Why does Russia liberate us from food and water? Well, that's the way that Russia rolls when they deal with their occupied, conquered people. That's the way that they look at them, as conquered subjects rather than as citizens. HIMARS strike near Kherson kills eight Russian officers, and so that was something to look for. Kremlin says that Abrams and ATACMS can't change the battlefield situation. Now, this was carried in Reuters. This was following Peskov's statement. And here's the statement. Quote, the Americans continue to increase their direct involvement in this conflict. But of course, every time our military improves its skills and technical capabilities to counter these missiles, they're full of bluster. It's a really interesting thing to watch how blustery they actually are. But it doesn't mean that they're actually going to. It doesn't mean that the Abrams and the ATACMS aren't going to make a significant impact. They are, especially ATACMS are going to make a huge difference on the battlefield, I think. Okay, details behind the Nord Stream pipeline blast was revealed by scientists, and this was carried in the Guardian, and then I'm going to show you something in RT about this as well. So here's the article in the Guardian, and I'm going to quote something because it's important for you to have this background and then hear the other background. Quote, researchers in Norway shared with the Guardian seismic evidence of the 4 explosions, becoming the first national body to publicly confirm the second 2 detonations, as well as revealing a detailed timeline of events. Now, this happened a year ago. This isn't anything new. Quote, a leaked U.S. defense document reported by the Washington Post showed the CIA had been tipped off by an allied European agency in June 2022, 3 months before the attack, that 6 members of Ukraine's Special Operations Forces were going to rent a boat and use a submersible vehicle to dive to the seabed using oxygen and helium for breathing in order to sabotage the pipeline. But the leaked U.S. document said that the planned operation had been put on hold. Okay, so that is what a relatively safe source, The Guardian, said about this. Here's RT. Seymour Hersh, Nord Stream attacks were aimed at Germany. Quote, a U.S. intelligence source had told Seymour Hersh that President Joe Biden ordered the destruction of the Nord Stream gas pipelines to prevent Germany from backtracking on promises to abandon Russian energy. And another quote, the President of the United States would rather see Germany freeze than Germany possibly stop supporting Ukraine, unquote. Hersh declared earlier this year. Okay. Seymour Hersh is an interesting character. He did some good work in the 1960s exposing some corruption, but then he's seen corruption everywhere. It's like the guy that predicted 15 of the last 3 hurricanes accurately. I mean, that's kind of how he is. So you can safely discount Seymour Hersh with his unnamed source in every one of his articles. Schmeil signs a resolution on verification of grain exports deal. He's still been working on this. The big dust up last week with Poland. They're still working out some of the kinks of the grain export deal, but I think this is a problem that has now largely gone away. So I'm not worried about that anymore. Zelensky signed a law replacing arrest with probation as the main type of criminal punishment. That's both good and bad. It's a double-edged sword. If it goes on too long, it can become something that causes more crime by not having legit punishment for something. And then, well, what does it matter? I'm just going to go do that. In the short term, however, it frees up some resources when you can do something like this. Okay, Sergei Shoigu says special military operation. It will go through 2025. Now, I did some quick calculations. If it goes through January of 2025, you have roughly 50 3-week special military operations. But of course, everything is going to plan. Now, I say 50 of these because it was supposed to last for about 3 weeks, and that's what the Russians were counting on, and that's why they engaged with it, because they thought it was going to be a quick victory and it would all be over in no time flat. Well, 50 cycles later is about when it would go to if it was through 2025. So it's not really going according to plan. Ukraine claims to have a massive database in the American embassy that it can use to track every weapon. Well, that's interesting. That would certainly take some of the fire out of the critics who were saying, we don't even know where these are. They're being sold on the black market. Every article that I've ever seen about how they're being sold on the black market from a reputable source, not from Jimbo's blog, not that, but from a reputable source, shows me that they know what they're doing and they have things in hand. It's not just willy-nilly weapons floating around the world. Okay, Wednesday, 27 September, Russia's Black Sea Fleet commander was shown in a video conference, theoretically alive. He didn't really say much, he was just sitting there with a pillow behind him, but okay. So that was an interesting thing after the announcement by the AFU that he was dead, but he didn't really do anything. He was just, I mean, that could have been old footage. We don't exactly know how that worked. Okay, Ukrainians are dismantling bombs for clues about Putin's army. So there's a quote here. What they're doing is when something has been blown up, they're looking at fragments, or if it didn't detonate, they're trying to take it apart and look at it, examine the components very closely to see where the components came from and try to trace those back in order to see if sanctions are working or what's getting through. Quote, we have the task of discovering the electronic components, aggregates, who is the manufacturer, the chips, the microelements. The Russians can't do much high-tech stuff. Almost all the high-tech components inside are imported. Yeah, and so because of sanctions, it's a very hard thing to create these. So I hear a lot of squawking about how the Russians are up on a wartime footing, but they can only actually produce dumb munitions. They can't really produce the high-tech stuff with sanctions very easily. Now, what's Europe's role in making killer drones, these Iran kamikaze drones? Well, quote, according to the paper obtained by The Guardian, 52 electrical components manufactured by Western companies were found in the Shahed 131 drone and 57 in the Shahed 136 model, which has a flight range of 2,000 kilometers or 12,040 miles and a cruising speed of 180 kilometers per hour, 111 miles per hour. And among these manufacturers are companies headquarters in the countries of the sanctions coalition, the United States, Switzerland, Netherlands, Germany, Canada, Japan, Poland, it claims. Okay, so some of these sanctioned parts are still getting through, and they're trying to figure out how do they close whatever loopholes are there. Now, it doesn't help that countries like Kazakhstan are involved in amplifying their trade, getting things that are sanctioned and then selling it to Russia. So they're working on those kind of things as well. Okay, Kremlin reacts to Hillary needling Putin for NATO enlargement. Apparently she said something about Putin and like how he brought this on himself. And so they're not happy with Hillary Clinton. I'm not a big Hillary Clinton supporter, so this is like bizarre to me to be pro-Hillary, but when the alternative is pro-Putin, you kind of get it. Defending democracy in Ukraine, expanding NATO, this is a quote, just as an aside, too bad, Vladimir, you brought it on yourself, she said, prompting laughter and applause. Reuters reported, we always said people are not forced to join NATO. People choose and want to join NATO, she added. That's actually quite right. Okay, so when Putin is talking about how NATO is expanding to the east, it's not exactly right. It's not like the nations are moving. It's the people in these countries are voluntarily choosing, I would rather be with NATO than be potentially captured and overrun by Russia. And that's why NATO is moving. NATO is not moving. It's these countries are wanting security from Russia. And so that's what's really happening. Zelensky fears Ukraine may split into two like Korea, says a Spanish magazine that's quoted in the article in Pravda, and they show this terrible map of Ukraine, which was once this size, it was very large, normal size Ukraine, being this tiny little bit, with Russia gobbling up this part and Poland gobbling up this part and Romania gobbling up that part, and there's like nothing left of Ukraine at the end of it. It's a perennial favorite in Pravda. Medvedev put out an image of this about a year ago, and it comes up periodically. It's nothing to see. Okay. Pravda says India tries to cure Prime Minister Trudeau of drug addiction. This was perhaps the worst article that I've read, I don't know, maybe even in the entire course of the war, as far as just poorly written, where an Indian ambassador is accusing Trudeau of having a plane full of cocaine and being out of his mind when he's visiting. And now it is entirely possible that this kind of thing happened. However, unless you verify it, unless you can, show something, it was just like somebody saying, well, he did this, and you can make up anything about anybody. You have to actually show that there's some kind of lines of facts and reasoning here, rather than, well, he's just out of his mind, he's crazy. There's no love lost between India and Canada at this point, and that wasn't really journalism. It was just a hit piece. And okay, here's a little quote from it. Indian diplomat and former Indian ambassador Sudan Deepak Vohra said that when Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau came to India for the G20 summit, quote, his plane was full of cocaine, unquote. According to Vohra, Trudeau did not leave his room for 2 days and skipped the presidential dinner because he was, quote, out of his mind due to drug use, unquote. Okay. So, I mean, it was that kind of piece it's the kind of piece that would be in something like the National Enquirer, the tabloid, that is just trying to be, getting your attention for stuff that they know isn't right. It could be. I don't know. I wasn't there, but I kind of, you can safely discount it until there are other facts about it. Okay, Russia and Ukraine war is a battle of perceptions between democracy and authoritarianism. This was an ABC News, Australian ABC News, and I was actually going to do a video about it because it was just that good. And then it was displaced by other things that overtook me that I had to address that day. Maybe I'll still go back to it because it's really true. There is a battle of perceptions between democracy and authoritarianism. One of the points that it made was like, look, you can't just say, well, the Russians, they're just not smart, and then operate on that. No, they're smart. I mean, they're going to do what they can with what they have, and so you don't want to discount your opponent. Okay. RT says that Ukrainian troops are surrendering en masse. More than 10,000 have apparently surrendered, according to RT, using the call sign 149200, call sign Volga. And so this was picked up, this was in TASS, and it was an RT, and then it was picked up in Redacted. I did a video reacting to Redacted when they talked about this. Here's a quote from the article. More than 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers have chosen life and used 149.200 Volga frequency to surrender. The prisoners are well fed and are provided with all the necessary medical care, the source said. Okay. So, well, what very often happens in Russian media, in my observation, is that whatever the Ukrainians do, the Russians will then copy it and amplify and try to make themselves look like they do it better. Whatever the Americans do, the Russians will say, well, we do this too, and show how much better they are at that. And so it's one of those kind of articles, and it's a really funny thing to watch. It's almost a childish way of operating. It's a very strange thing to watch, see again and again. Okay, RT surges after X, that's Twitter, removes censorship disinformation. Lobbyist. So the RT is much more useful. You can't find it on YouTube. You can't find it on Roku except through Rumble, and that's where I find my RT videos. And then I watch them religiously in order to compare notes against what's going on in the West. RT is a RT English or America is an English version of the same thing, and they're trying to spread their message. So I'm looking at it, trying to understand what message do they actually want to communicate, and why, and what are they trying to say? Well, Twitter has removed some of the things about disinformation because, and I think rightly so, in the sense that if you can do this to one group, what happens to another group, and what if that's your group? I mean, I would far rather be able to argue with it. Now, not everybody's going to agree with me, and I understand that, but I would far rather to see truth rise to the top because we're willing to take the time to argue with bad than to potentially shut down true or accurate or the right side of the equation, because who gets to decide who's true or right? So it's a little bit more Wild West on Twitter, but that's okay. You can actually see what they're saying and then deal with it. Okay, here's a quote. Around the same time, X ended its shadow ban on RT and others, lifting a restriction imposed under the previous executive leadership. Now, RT's happy about that. That tells you that something about, the way this policy works is breaking in their favor, and they like that. But I'm telling you, I'm a free speech guy, and I think that that's probably better than restricting speech, because if it can happen to them, it can happen to you. You don't have to agree with me. I'm curious what your thoughts are. You can put them in the comments, but please be fair to my position. Don't just say, well, he's all in the bag for RT. I'm certainly not. I use them in order to fight them. Okay, Thursday, 28th September, the EU threatened sales bans to block the use of Western parts in drones. This is part of what we were just talking about, where some of these parts are still slipping into supplies of Shahed drones and other things. Quote, customs information was said to show that almost all the imports to Iran originated from Turkey, India, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Vietnam, and Costa Rica. So if sanctions are on Russia and Iran, what they'll do is Iran will get it from Turkey, which doesn't have that, or from India, which doesn't have a ban. And so if we sell these parts to India, India then turns around, sells it to Iran, makes a profit, and then that's how they get it. Okay, Senate funding plan hits GOP turbulence over Ukraine. So they're trying to work out the budget. They're working their way toward a potential government shutdown. It was averted, but they're working toward that. Quote, a number of Senate Republicans are threatening to oppose legislation to fund the government beyond September 30th because of $6.1 billion in funding for Ukraine and the lack of language addressing a huge surge of migrants across the U.S.-Mexican border. Okay. So those are two very different things, but Republicans tend to say, well, we're not even addressing, and this is particularly Republicans who don't want to support Ukraine. They'll say, we're not even addressing what's going on at our own border. Why are we giving money to Ukraine? And that's the argument that they use. Okay, House advances Ukraine aid after leaders strip money from defense bill. This was in the Hill. Quote, the House GOP leaders moved late Wednesday night to strip the funding from the defense bill and hold a separate vote on it amid an uncertainty regarding the legislation's chance of passing. Top Republicans made that decision even after the House, including a majority of Republicans, overwhelmingly rejected an amendment to strip the $300 million from the defense appropriations bill. The amendment, sponsored by Andy Biggs, failed a 330 to 104 vote. I mean, that is pretty lopsided. But there's about 90 or so Republicans that will break away from Ukraine as opposed to vote with it. Okay. So RT had an article here on the same day that Trump says that Russia is, quote, making a fortune. According to Trump, the U.S. was more energy independent than Russia and China during his tenure as president, while we are now begging countries to give us gasoline. Okay, well, he's actually kind of right about that. We were more energy independent during that time. Quote, we are going to lose our country, unquote, Trump warned, arguing that Moscow has, quote, made a fortune and continues to benefit from high oil prices. It's kind of true. Like, if we were pumping out oil still in the United States, the price of oil would have reduced for Russia as well for us, but as well for Russia. So he's not wrong. NATO chief says that Ukraine is gradually gaining ground, and Yes, but it's so gradual. It's incredibly gradual, and it's not moving as fast as it needs to move in order to really break the hold that Russia has on as far as the land bridge, to Crimea. Hopefully, ATACMS will help with that significantly. Britain's Shaps meets with Zelensky on his first visit to Kyiv, and we're going to hear more about that in just a little bit. There's a report in the Drive that Russia has gained the most ground this year, and that's a report echoing the New York Times. And so, it's true from January to now, but really there's been no movement for Russia since the summer. It's largely, almost all, been Ukraine, but it's very small gains for Ukraine. And so it's like half the size of Manhattan or something like that. It's not a big chunk of territory because they have to get through minefields without air support. That it's it's a very difficult thing to have accomplished. And then there was another RT article that Kyiv lost 17,000 troops in September, 83,000 since the offensive began. That's something like 5,000 to 6,000 per day since June 6th. It's ridiculous numbers. And I said this in a video the other day. If you actually think through that, it's unsustainable to either lie or to actually have that happen. So whichever is happening, it's just, you'll see the proof in the pudding in time. Okay. This is Friday, the 29th of September. The SBU destroys Kosta radar in Kursk region. I don't know what a Kosta radar is. I would imagine it's a radar system that's somewhat valuable if they're talking about this. But I'm not a military expert, so I can't really explain that kind of thing very well. Pravda said a former U.S. intelligence officer said that Zelensky should flee Ukraine for his wife and his children's sake. And so that got my notice. And then I realized, oh, it's Scott Ritter. Scott Ritter believes Zelensky could face the wrath of officers who feel betrayed by his incompetence. Okay. You can safely discount Scott Ritter and his perception of this. He's just in the tank for Russia. But I mean, even then, that was just poorly written. Scott Ritter believes that Zelensky could face the wrath of officers who feel betrayed by his incompetence. If you ask Ukrainians, you probably won't see that perspective, but that's Ritter. Pravda had an article, Putin signs a decree allowing Ukrainians to enter Russia visa-free. I thought, did I just read that? And then I read the article and I looked back over it again and I thought, that's crazy. Now I know what Putin's doing. He's trying to, bring Ukrainians in. Hey, come on in. Probably change out their passport with a Russian passport and trying to Russify Ukrainians. But that'll also allow a lot of Ukrainians that they don't want in the country to get in to sabotage things. And yeah, I think that's probably a pretty bad policy. Ukrainians are heartened by delivery of U.S. Abrams tanks. Well, it took long enough. I mean, we're talking about Abrams tanks 6 months ago, something like that, and they're finally arriving. So, okay. Saturday, 30 September, Zelensky says our priority is the development of defense production. Yes. Now, the quote is a little bit off, but defense production goes beyond the quote. Here's the quote. The Sky Shield and the demining are the two biggest priorities for us today, the head of state said during a meeting. That is why we prioritize the development of defense production using modern technologies, production of shells, missiles, drones in Ukraine in cooperation with global leaders in the field and using our experience in their operation. That's smart, long-term thinking. Zelensky has to keep his eye on both the acute, what's going on right now that I have to address to keep alive. That's like if you see a guy on a floor that you just came upon, you don't know what's going on, you check his breathing first, and then you check his blood pressure, and then you check for wounds on his body. So now that you got the breathing taken care of and the blood pressure, you want to make sure that he doesn't bleed out somewhere. And long term, they need to have their own defense production. They also need it to not get destroyed by Russian missiles. Shmuel says 37 Ukrainian defense industry enterprises were damaged by Russian missile attacks. So that's what I was just saying. You can't have, you can develop it in country, but you also have to defend it too. Okay, 27,000 Ukrainian servicemen will receive training from the EU, according to Borrell, who just visited not too long ago. And that's good, but I hope that their training has mutated some. So they would receive something 3 weeks or more, hopefully more than that, of that's the low end of NATO training, the Ukrainian soldiers. But NATO training, NATO doctrine isn't what they need for taking these trenches and getting through these minefields and that kind of thing. In our military doctrine, and I was an Army ROTC for only 2 years before Bill Clinton killed my program and said thank you for coming. It was part of the peace dividend. But so I'm not bitter, but that's what happened to me. But I do remember that in our doctrine, you use overwhelming superiority of firepower. Like you would move when you suppress the enemy with firepower and then move, right? And that's kind of thing. The Ukrainians don't necessarily have that luxury. Without, and on a larger scale, without air support, trying to get through the minefield, without the proper tools to be able to do the job, they're expected to do the job. NATO training hasn't seemed to have caught up to that yet, from what I have heard about reports of what the training was relative to what they have to do. Okay. Let's see. How will Europe weather a second winter without gas from Russia? So that's one part of the problem, and then the other part of the problem is they have to actually deal with, what will happen when Russia targets the energy sectors within Ukraine. Okay, another article, what we know on the criminal prosecution of the former governor of the National Bank. And so there are, this was in the Kharkiv human rights article. And so there's a lot of prosecution of corruption. This might have gotten a little bit far, though, in the way that it's being carried out, according to this article. I only know what I know from this article. And it said that the article provides for 8 to 12 years in prison. And they talked about, this article and that article, like he violated misappropriation of funds on a large scale, money laundering of the crime. But there was this thieving article within it that he was being prosecuted for. And it said this, quote, the above suggests that NABU and the SAP decided to fill in the gaps of the evidence based on the charges against Kirilo Shevchenko by pressuring other subjects. All of them suddenly decided to plead guilty by entering into plea bargains. They're ready to be convicted under these agreements, but for less severe crimes, committing to testify against Shevchenko. It's quite worrying that this practice, seen in some cases before, may become much more widespread. These methods will resemble Soviet times and the arbitrariness of law enforcement under Yanukovych. That's something that they have to guard against. I'm not saying that that's happening. I don't know how much it's happening or the degree to which it's happening, but what's been interesting about Ukraine compared to Russia is Ukraine has been really working carefully to try to integrate into Europe and to try to cure its corruption issues. Russia has been headlong re-Sovietizing. It's really bizarre to watch the difference between the two in the laws that are passed and the way that they're going about doing things. And this is much more of a earlier Soviet method, according to this article, and it's just something to keep our eyes on. Okay, British troops could deploy to Ukraine for the first time, says Grant Shapps. But of course, the Prime Minister Sunak walked this back shortly thereafter. So Shapps is not a military man. He's learning his job as he goes, and he was a cabinet position of 6 different types of cabinet positions. He's apparently a good utility player, but he's got to learn a lot about this. And one of the things is, I think he overpromised, and then Prime Minister Sunak had to walk it back. Putting Ukrainian trainers on the ground in Ukraine seems like a not so good idea. There are British troops there in Ukraine, just like there are American troops in Ukraine, but those are like at the embassy, guarding the embassy. That's a whole different thing than being boots on the ground, even as trainers. Okay, Putin, Medvedev, and combined spin with threats on the anniversary of the unilateral annexations of Ukraine. So there was a big party on September 30th where Putin is celebrating the one-year anniversary of incorporating the Donetsk People's Republic and the other three oblasts into the fold. Of course, the longer this goes on, the longer the argument that Russia will have to say this was ours. We've had it for this long after all. So you want to get this sorted out sooner than later if possible. Sunday, October 1st, Russia and Ukraine trade missile strikes. Ukraine's rockets over Crimea were shot down, and Russia was just still hammering Ukraine with missiles. RT said that the Slovak Social Democracy SMER SD party wins in Slovakia, and I did a video about that. It was really interesting to see just what had happened there. So the SMER party is a left-wing populist party. In the United States, we think of the populist as the right wing, but Bernie Sanders' party is a populist party as well. That's what this is. It's a left-wing populist party. Slovakia and the people of Slovakia have bigger problems than Ukraine. He said at a press conference following the announcement of the election results, the SMER SD won about 23% of the vote, with its closest competitor, Progressive Slovakia, receiving some 18%. And so the leader of the party that won the largest, I don't know how to say this, minority, because it's not really a majority of the whole, it's the largest majority compared to the others. It's not really a majority, the largest minority, I guess. That group gets to form a government and work with other groups in order. It's a hard thing to explain to an American mind because we have a winner-take-all system between the two-party system. Yeah, and so, but it's not good because now Slovakia, like Hungary, can be kind of a fly in the ointment, and heavens help us if Poland goes down that route. So we'll see how that all plays out in a couple of weeks. Ukraine is trying to protect the energy grid before the winter. They need to do that. They need to be thinking through that. Fool me once, shame on me, right? Or shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. U.S. government averts government shutdown, but removed new Ukraine support, at least temporarily. And so that was a bad look, at least in the United States. I thought this was a bad thing that got taken out. But Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican from South Carolina, says that Ukraine aid will not be separated from border funding. Border funding is an article that's near and dear to the hearts, particularly of the Trump Republican types. And so to declare that it's not going to be separated will give a lot of pushback to the pushback, if that makes any sense. Okay, that's it. That's all the articles for this last week. It wasn't nearly as exciting a week as far as like a sub being hit or the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet being blown up, but a lot was happening, but not a lot of movement, aggressive movement on the ground, making significant gains. Hopefully we'll see more of that in the weeks to come. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, the coffees, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.